The U.S. government's neo-colonial chokehold over Latin America is weakening, and the region is becoming more and more independent. In this video, I'm going to talk about two very important developments that are related to that. One is the Mexican president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, known as Amlo, the first left-wing president in many years in Mexico, took a historic trip to Cuba in which he called for the U.S. to end its illegal blockade of Cuba and its sanctions, and he called for Latin American unity. And the other part of this video, which is related, is about the so-called Summit of the Americas, which is being held in the United States in Los Angeles, California this June. And AMLO and other leaders in Latin America and the Caribbean have pledged that they're going to boycott this summit because the U.S. government refuses to invite Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. These are really important developments for Latin America and the Caribbean and for the U.S. And it really reflects how this region that has been so oppressed and colonized and brutalized by the U.S. for 200 years has been resisting more and more and has been pushing for its own independence and sovereignty. So I'm going to begin this video first talking about the Summit of the Americas briefly, and then I'm going to talk about the historic trip taken by Mexico's President López Obrador to Cuba and why that's very important. First, the Summit of the Americas. What is this? The Summit of the Americas is this conference that brings together all of the governments in North, Central, and South America and the Caribbean. Now, the Summit of the Americas was originally called for by the U.S. government back in 1994, and it was to try to push through neoliberal trade agreements. The Bill Clinton administration had just passed NAFTA, and this is, of course, right after the end of the First Cold War. This is peak neoliberalism. This is Washington trying to impose, this finance capitalism all over the region and break down trade barriers. So the Summit of the Americas has its roots in the U.S. government. It is also closely linked to the Organization of American States. I've done videos talking about the OAS, which is basically an arm of the U.S. government, an arm of U.S. foreign policy that was created by the U.S. government in 1948 at the beginning of the First Cold War as a coalition of anti-communist right-wing regimes in Latin America. And it was basically an attempt by Washington to prevent any country in Latin America or the Caribbean from joining with the Soviet Union in the Cold War, the First Cold War. Now, the OAS, people, you can check out my other videos talking about the OAS, its role in supporting coups, including the 2019 far-right coup in Bolivia against the democratically elected socialist president Evo Morales. The OAS recognizes coup puppet Juan Guaido as fake president of Venezuela. So I've done videos talking about that. Nicaragua recently left the OAS. Venezuela left the OAS. Cuba was kicked out of the OAS in 1962 after its revolution. So this Summit of the Americas is very much, linked to the U.S. government and the OAS, but historically it has been held in numerous countries in Latin America, and it did bring together the leaders of all of the countries in Latin America, although Cuba has sometimes been the exception. But this year is different. This June, the Summit of the Americas is supposed to be held in Los Angeles, California, but the U.S. government refused to invite Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. These are the three governments with socialist parties in power, and the U.S. government called them the so-called Troika of tyranny. Actually, it's the Troika of resistance against U.S. imperialism and capitalism. And we've seen that numerous leaders in Latin America and the Caribbean have said they're going to boycott the Summit of the Americas if the U.S. refuses to invite Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, has said that he's going to boycott it if they're not invited. Now, the most recent development is that the leftist president of Bolivia has also said that he's going to boycott it for the same reason. Here is a report from Causachu News, a great media outlet, independent alternative media outlet based in Bolivia, based in the social movements. And President Luis Arce said, quote, "A summit of the Americas which excludes American countries will not be a full summit of the Americas. If the exclusion of our brother peoples persists, I will not participate. And he's, of course, talking about Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela being excluded. So this is very important. And also, this is a report from the great website Venezuela Analysis, talking about how the 14 members of the Caribbean community, known as CARICOM, have also vowed to boycott it if Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua are not invited. The Caribbean countries are close allies of Venezuela in particular. Venezuela under Hugo Chavez, and since then under Nicolas Maduro, under the Bolivarian Revolution, has really gone out of its way to strengthen its alliance with the Caribbean countries, supporting them economically and politically and diplomatically, making them part of its Petro-Caribe program, in which Venezuela provided them with very cheap oil and support. So the 14 countries making up the Caribbean have also vowed to boycott the Summit of the Americas if Venezuela is not allowed to participate. And today, in the rest of this video, I'm going to talk about the historic decision by Mexico's president, López Obrador, who has also said that he is not going to attend the Summit of the Americas if those three countries are not allowed to participate. So here, now I'm going to talk about the historic trip taken by the president of Mexico, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, Amlo, to Cuba, in which he called for an end to the U.S. blockade, and he called for Latin American unity. This is very important. This is historic. We should keep in mind Mexico is the second largest country in Latin America after Brazil. Mexico has the 10th largest country on earth in terms of population. It's slightly larger than Japan. It's a bit smaller than Russia. I mean, this is a very important country. Mexico has the second largest economy in Latin America after Brazil. So this is a very important country. And for decades, Mexico had neoliberal regimes dominating really since the 1980s. And in 2018, the people of Mexico voted overwhelmingly for the first left-wing president in decades. Here you can see in the blue suit, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, or his two last names, he's known as just López Obrador. And he just took a historic trip to Cuba. López Obrador came in promising to break the neoliberal orthodoxy that had its chokehold on Mexico for decades. He created a left-wing party called Morena, which defeated the bipartisan dictatorship, the two-party dictatorship that had dominated Mexico for decades. And he has challenged the neoliberal policies. And he also has taken an independent foreign policy. I'll talk about in a second how it's not perfect. There are certainly criticisms. But one of the examples of his incredible bravery as the leader of the country that has a massive border with the United States, right there on the southern border with a sword of Damocles hanging over it, is that he just visited Cuba and called for an end to the U.S. blockade. This is incredible. Here in these photos, I'll show in a second, you can see him meeting with Raúl Castro, the revolutionary and former general, and with the current president, Miguel Díaz-Canel. So I'll talk about that in a second. So López Obrador, known by the acronym AMLO, AMLO, because his name is Andrés Manuel López Obrador, so AMLO, AMLO. He took this trip, and he said that this is a quote. He said that, well, actually, he made these comments in Belize, which I'll talk about in a second. But he said, quote, the economic decline of the United States. He said that openly. He said that it provides an opportunity for the region, and he called for the region to unite, and he criticized right-wing coup-plotters, using the term golpistas, which means coup-plotter in Spanish. So let me go through some of the main points here. In La Habana, the capital of Cuba, on May 8th, López Obrador met with the Cuban president, Miguel Díaz-Canel, and he thanked, quote, the generous, supportive, and exemplar people of Cuba. So praise the people of Cuba. And then this is an important quote. AMLO said, I have never sought and do not seek and will not seek the failure of the Cuban Revolution, of its idea of justice and its lessons of independence and dignity. I will never join with the coup plotters, the golpistas, who conspire against those ideals. That's a pretty incredible statement. So obviously he's not saying openly, I support the Cuban Revolution and socialism, but I will never be against it, and I will never join with the coup plotters who are against it. Then, incredibly, he said, quote, I will keep trying to get the United States to lift the blockade. The U.S. sanctions on Cuba began in 1960, almost immediately after the revolution in 1959. Before, by the way, Cuba even became an ally of the Soviet Union, which was largely a response to the brutal and illegal U.S. sanctions and blockade on Cuba. Mexico and Cuba, they signed several agreements, and one of those agreements was also to provide vaccines, because Cuba has created 6 COVID vaccines, and as part of the agreement, Cuba is going to be sending the Abdala vaccine, which is for children between ages 5 and 12. I mean, it's really incredible that Cuba was able to accomplish 6 COVID vaccines despite the illegal criminal U.S. blockade and sanctions against it. And in this historic visit, López Obrador, the Mexican president, called for Latin American unity. He said, quote, we should build something similar to the European Union, but based on our history, reality, and identities. Quote, in that spirit, we should not rule out the elimination of the Organization of American States for a truly autonomous organization that is not a lackey of anyone. So, wow, pretty powerful statement there, condemning the OAS as a lackey, and he's clearly implying that it's a lackey of the United States. And then he also met with Raúl Castro, the brother of Fidel Castro and one of the leaders of the Cuban Revolution. So this is a powerful image. And again, it's very important considering Mexico is a very important, large country, the southern neighbor of the United States. And for decades, since the 1980s, it had neoliberal governments that largely just followed whatever Washington wanted them to do and never challenged U.S. imperialism. So there are other comments that Amlo made during this tour he had of Latin America. He also went to the Central American country of Belize. He met with the Prime Minister of Belize, John Antonio Briceño. And in that meeting, he made very interesting comments. Amlo said, quote, I maintain that it is necessary to move forward in an integration of all of America and the construction of a model similar to that of the European community, a model that preceded what is today the European Union. Now, this is interesting because Amlo in his comments, he has repeatedly said that Latin America should create something like the European Union, but here he's actually fleshing out his idea a bit more and saying that it should be more like the European community, which is what preceded the EU. And I think the main distinction there would be the EU has a common currency, the euro. And maybe when he's talking about the European community, he's saying that each country can have its own domestic currency, but can still be part of a kind of economic bloc. I think that's what he's implying there. I'm not entirely sure. And then he continued. This is an incredible quote. Only in that way can we confront the turbulence of the global economy and the geopolitical danger that the economic decline of the United States represents for all of the world. And then he contrasts that to other regions, especially Asia. And in particular, I am referring to the economic advance of China. So he's saying that the economic decline of the U.S. represents these problems, these dangers for the world. I think what he's hinting at is not only, the problems that there are now with inflation, but I think he's also hinting at the rise of fascism and instability and extremist movements in the United States. And of course, Mexico, over half of its trade is with the United States. It's very important for Mexico and its economy and its stability. And then he also mentions the rise of China, of course, and the rise of Asia as an opportunity for Latin America to be able to do business with them. So if Latin America can unite, it can take advantage of the rise of Asia and try to develop itself following the model of East Asia. And then he adds, quote, in addition to halting this course of undesirable events, the Union of America would develop our natural resources, tourism, and our financial systems to provide well-being and justice for our populations, to jointly confront problems like poverty, immigration, and insecurity. Again, this is incredible. A full-fledged call for Latin American unity to fight poverty, immigration, and insecurity, economic integration. This is exactly what the U.S. is so afraid of. This is what the U.S. empire has done everything it can to try to prevent. And this is what the so-called Monroe Doctrine has been aimed at trying to prevent this kind of unity in Latin America, and to prevent it especially from working with China and also Russia. Here in the article, I talk about López Obrador saying that he's thinking of not attending the Summit of the Americas if other countries are excluded. And he indirectly called for Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua to be invited to the Summit of the Americas. That's what I began this video talking about. And finally, just concluding here, just a few things about this trip that Amlo made. There are valid criticisms of Amlo. One of them is that he just took this trip of Central America and Cuba. And in addition to Cuba and Belize, he also visited Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. And in Honduras, he met with the new left-wing president, Xiomara Castro. But there were some socialists in Latin America who criticized Amlo for this trip because he left out Nicaragua, which has the socialist Sandinista government, which was a move that is very questionable. Now, some people pointed out that his trip was also aimed at meeting with the countries that are responsible for most immigration to Mexico, and Guatemala, Salvador, and Honduras are responsible for the majority of immigration to Mexico, but Belize is not responsible for much immigration to Mexico. So, I mean, this is clearly an act by the foreign ministry of Mexico. I don't even think López Obrador made this decision. I think it's the Mexican foreign minister, Marcelo Ebrard, who's much more centrist. He's not nearly as left-wing as López Obrador. And Ebrard has been really criticized a lot in Latin America for being too soft and too friendly to the United States. And it seems that as part of his attempt to try to isolate the Sandinista socialist government in Nicaragua, he said that López Obrador should not visit Nicaragua, even though he was right next door in Honduras and El Salvador. And what's frustrating about that is that the Mexican government has criticized Nicaragua for the Sandinista front continuing to win democratic elections and the re-election for the fourth term of Daniel Ortega. So even though he was democratically elected, Mexico has criticized that and saying that it's supposedly not democratic. Well, what's shameful about that is that AMLO had no problem meeting with the extremely corrupt right-wing president of Guatemala, Alejandro Giammattei, who is very corrupt. So, I mean, that's hypocritical. And it's even more hypocritical that he had no problem meeting with the millennial authoritarian neoliberal president of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele. And Bukele, I mean, in addition to just being a complete neoliberal technocrat who has been just gambling away all of the country's assets of poor El Salvadorians on Bitcoin, in addition to that insanity, he also has been doing a vicious, brutal crackdown on dissent in the country. In April alone, he detained more than 20,000 people. The El Salvadorian president, Bukele, detained more than 20,000 people in 33 days in April and a bit past April. And he claimed that it was a crackdown on gangs, but it also was a brutal suppression of his political opponents. So what's frustrating is that AMLO was willing to meet with the authoritarian leaders of Guatemala and El Salvador, who are right-wing, but not with the socialist president of Nicaragua, Daniel Ortega. So there are criticisms, and I pointed out in my article that it's pretty ironic, given that he has been calling for unifying the region and has been criticizing the Summit of the Americas for refusing to invite Nicaragua, but he also skipped over Nicaragua in his trip in Central America. So, I mean, there are criticisms of AMLO. He's not a socialist. He's not a revolutionary. But as I point out in the article, he still has an independent foreign policy. He refused to impose sanctions on Russia over its war in Ukraine. He even criticized the U.S. government for claiming that his country hosts more Russian spies than any other country. And I point out that AMLO is Mexico's first left-wing president in decades. His progressive Morena party has helped break the two-party dictatorship. It deserves a lot of credit for breaking with the neoliberal PRI party, PRI, and the right-wing PAN party, PAN. And a recent poll, it really does show how extremely popular Amlo and his party, Morena, are. This poll from May shows that 65% of Mexicans say that Morena, more than any other party, helps the people who have less. So helps, underprivileged people, poor people, humble people. 64% of Mexicans say that Morena manages social programs better than the other parties. 59% say that of all the parties, Morena cares the most about the people. 46% say of all parties, it manages the economy the best. And meanwhile, 58% say the neoliberal PRI party damaged the country the most. And 52% say that the neoliberal PRI party robbed the government more than other parties. And it should be pointed out that López Obrador consistently has an approval rating of between 60 and 70%, around 2/3. That makes him one of the most popular leaders of a large country on the planet. So this is important. A Mexican leader calling for the end of the U.S. blockade in Cuba, calling for unity in Latin America, and then, of course, numerous leaders, including the presidents of Mexico and Bolivia and the countries in the Caribbean, saying they're not going to attend the Summit of the Americas if the U.S. government refuses to invite Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua. These are all historic developments, and it really shows how Latin America continues to rebel against U.S. neocolonialism and fight for its independence and sovereignty.